Thank you. You know, I'm going to bring up our panel. I'll be introducing them as they're on their way up. And then we'll start what I expect to be a very interesting discussion here this afternoon. So let's begin with Karen Curry. She was the executive producer for CNN. She happened to be based in New York at the time. Of course, the network was on the air with this story. She was the vice president and the New York bureau chief at that time. Karen, would you join me up here? And by the way, Karen also has international experience. Before she went to CNN in New York, she was the London bureau chief for CNN, one of the busiest, NBC, I'm sorry, one of the busiest duty stations in the world. Harry Donahue, colleague of mine, longtime anchor at KYW Newsradio. I don't think there's anybody in this room who hasn't heard Harry's wake-up voice in the morning.
Not recently.
Well, not recently. Of course, we should mention he's retired, except for one thing. People in this industry never seem to retire. At least that's what my wife says. Another colleague from KYW News Radio, Tony Hansen, also retired. He was on the ground in New York shortly after this story broke and became international news. Tony, welcome. Robin McIntosh, long-time CBS 3 reporter, a man who's covered it all in the Delaware Valley and elsewhere. Robin, welcome. Should I mention also retired? You know, who else has time to come to these? Terry Ruggles, a longtime friend, worked for Channel 10, an anchor, a reporter, another one who's been through it all. Yeah, retired. And Tim Lambert, please. A reporter and anchor for WGT Radio in Gettysburg. He started. He's now at WTIF in Harrisburg, where he was on 9/11. And Tim is the new wave. He's not retired.
Yet.
And he's also multimedia, which, as we all know, is the wave of our future. You know, Jerry Wilkinson touched on this, where we were. Well, in anybody's lifetime, it seems in every generation, you may have one moment in time. It could be a day, it could be a week, an event that's so dramatic and unfortunately catastrophic that it sears into the memory. There are some of us who, in midlife, would often talk about where we were on Pearl Harbor Day. Then others in midlife talked about where they were when John F. Kennedy was shot. And now, there's hardly anyone that you know under 17 years of age, well, maybe 20, that won't tell you where they were on 9/11. Some of us in this room have experienced all three. And you can always hope there'll never be another. But let's begin. When you think of how a media, especially in Philadelphia, we're 90 miles away from the scene, you have a national story, a global story, and at the same time, you want to make it just a little more relevant to a local audience. and readership. And at the same time, you have to figure out exactly what is happening and how you're going to convey it to the audience. Karen Curry probably had one of the most difficult jobs at CNN. When this is happening, you have a newsroom that needs direction, reporters ready to do what reporters do, writers ready to do what writers do, editors ready to do what editors do. But Karen, could you tell us what those early moments might have been like in that newsroom?
Yeah, sure. Hi. Great to be here. That morning was New York Fashion Week. So the New York Bureau was flat out covering fashion. In those days, fashion was a big part of the CNN coverage. So pretty much everybody we had was out somewhere within the city getting ready to do Fashion Week. We had a morning call with Atlanta at about 8:30. And you know, you have an image, because I was around for JFK, and my image was the loudspeaker with the nun making the announcement that the president had been shot. My image is the speakerphone in the middle of my desk with a bunch of folks around, and we're going through all these really earth-shattering stories about fashion that we're working on for that day. And a guy comes running into my office, very red-faced, and he was kind of a practical joker. And he said, "A plane just went into the World Trade Center." And I was about to say, but then I said, Art just said a plane went into the World Trade Center. We'll see what we can find out. Well, meanwhile, everybody went into action. CNN at that time in New York didn't have a helicopter, but we had deals with various affiliates. So we were able to take chopper feeds from the different affiliates to get a sense of what was going on. Everybody is making a million phone calls. We happen to have several really well-sourced reporters in the Bureau with law enforcement. So we were able to get some pretty good information to go on initially, but we were the New York Bureau. We were not the heart of CNN. That was still very much in Atlanta. So we were coordinating back and forth with them, figuring out what to do. We had a live position that we used on a balcony that happened to have as its backdrop the World Trade Center, but we weren't permanently wired up there. So we cabled up there. Aaron Brown, whom I'm sure most of you know now, had just joined CNN, although he hadn't gone on the air yet. So he comes into my office, takes off his shirt, puts on a clean shirt and a tie, and runs up to this outdoor location. And then, as newsrooms do what they do, everybody's trying to get as much information that they can to source it, to go with. And he's the face of CNN at that point. And as it turned out, while he was live on the air, the towers actually came down. So it was one of those awful, cynical TV dumb luck things that our live location happened to be that location at that time of the story. But what was different about that is I worked in London a long time, and we send people all over the world to cover war zones. This was my first situation of working in what was becoming a war zone. So you had staff who were not only out there covering the story, but wondering where their families were, if they knew people in the World Trade Center. So it was that kind of crazy balance of people doing what they do as journalists and yet doing what they feel they need to do as people. We did not account for everybody in the Bureau until late that afternoon. Cell phones weren't working, beepers weren't working. Finally, the last of our producers phoned in to say that she had taken shelter somewhere downtown, and this was the first that she could get out. So it was an interesting example of which I'm sure, when you cover crime in a major city, you guys have to deal with that all the time. You're covering these traumatic situations day in and day out in the city you live in. For us as a national broadcaster, it was a unique situation, and that added to the complexity of not just getting the information, but kind of holding everybody together through the process.
Karen, thanks. I want you to get a picture for a minute of a guy in a bubble, a studio. And there he is, 24-hour news operation for radio, fast-moving operation. The anchor is dependent on people out in the newsroom to get him the information he needs to go on. He can see a TV monitor, he knows things are happening, he may know big things are happening. but he's dependent on others to get that to him. Harry Donahue was the anchor at KYW News Radio when the first and then the second plane hit the World Trade Center. Harry, what were you thinking?
Well, just to correct you, Jay, I wasn't on the air for the first. That happened around 8:42 or something like that morning. I actually was going back on the air because we rotated anchors at the time. So I was going back on the air at 9, but I was getting my hour script ready for the 9 to 10 hour. And you have to understand the makeup of the newsroom at the time. We have what we call an editor, which is like a producer. Lauren Lipton was the editor that morning. We have anchors, and then we have an inside reporter. The technical term is correlator. That was Al Novak. And Al Novak had gotten a blurb. I'm not sure how he got it. Al was a volunteer fireman, by the way, and he used to be on scanners all the time. Well, he also picked up scans from New York. And I remember sitting there about 20 feet from him, and he hollered over to Lauren, "Lauren, a plane just went into one of the towers at the World Trade Center." And, of course, the immediate question is, what type of plane is it? Now, there was nothing on TV yet at all. And Al says, they're not saying, they just said a plane went in. So then we were able to monitor our sister station in New York City, WINS, 1010 Winds. And they had a guy, their helicopter reporter, traffic reporter, had circled over to the World Trade Center and was reporting on their air live that, yes, some type of aircraft had gone in to one of the towers. Now, this is still a little before 10 and 9 or so. That's all we knew at that time. So I go up to Lauren, and she's trying to figure out now, what are we going to do with this story? And if you're familiar with KYW, you know, we live on the fly, and we were obviously going to make this story one of our headline stories. I don't know if it was the top story, though, at 9 o'clock, given the circumstances. It was in New York City. We didn't know what type of aircraft. All we had were reports that some type of aircraft had gone into the tower. So I'm getting ready to go in at 2 minutes of 9, and we have a strict format, of course, and Al had picked up a scan saying it was a commercial airliner. So now, once again, no television, and you know, and Al had this, and then WINS reported the same thing. So, a commercial airliner in the World Trade Center at a little before 9 o'clock on a beautiful morning in September. Something had to happen to it. Why did it get off course? Where was it going? How many people? All those questions. Right around that time, the Today Show at 9 o'clock was staying on the air, and we have in our studio two very small, when I say that, about 6-inch TV monitors, which I had on as I sat down. I did my headline package. We go to our traffic report at 9:02. I'll never forget it. Sam Clover, who's still doing traffic, was the guy I tossed to. Here's Sam with the latest on traffic and transit. I'm looking at the monitor, and all of a sudden, I see an aircraft go into one of the towers. I got on the intercom, and I said to Lauren Lipton, the editor, I said, "Are you watching TV right now?" And she said, well, I was distracted. Why? I said, well, unless this is a tape of what happened 20 minutes ago, another plane just went into another tower. That's how it happened. And she went, oh my God. And Al, in his scanner, I could hear him in the background with the intercom saying, Lauren, another plane just went into the other tower. So now I come out of the traffic report with Sam. We do a news alert bulletin that for a second aircraft has crashed into the World Trade Center towers in New York City. Not much to go on. Stay with us. We'll have details. Information started coming out like crazy from the wire services, which we monitor, from Al's scanner, from our sister station, WINS and WCBS in New York. And we made a decision right then and there to pick them up live, WCBS and WINS, because they had reporters en route. We were just covering in order to just people, because in Philadelphia, I always said when somebody asked me what's the most exciting part about your job, if something happens anywhere, be it in Philadelphia, the suburbs, or the world, chances are people are going to find out maybe for the first time about it on KYW. So we knew our responsibility in terms of informing our audience. And sure enough, the worst had happened. And from that moment on, that last report by Sam was probably the last traffic report for 24 hours, because that was like the last thing people wanted, I think, was traffic information. They weren't tuning into us for that. And we had no commercials for, Bill Roswell is sitting over there. He is, I think, was the assistant news director at the time. All commercials were dropped from the station for the rest of the week. And this is really amazing when you consider the growth of our sister station, WIP. WYSP, it was still under the YSP call letters, decided that they were going to simulcast KYW. They did it in Morning Drive with Angelo's show, and they did it for 2 or 3 days. So you were able to listen to KY both at 1060 and also at 94.1. So that was my experience with the day it happened, Jay.
Well, as Harry was on the air, management at the station was moving quickly. We did not even know at the time, as it hadn't happened yet, that the Pentagon was to be hit. But things were moving, and we were going to send reporters. Tony Hansen was on his way to New York almost immediately. I was on my way to Washington to talk to people in Congress and the administration. Tony, one of the most fascinating stories that I remember with Tony at the time was just trying to get into New York under very chaotic circumstances.
One of the, I've said many times, remarkable things about working as a reporter and being in this business is the unpredictability. You don't know where your day is going to lead when you leave the house in the morning. And on no day is that truer, that reality truer than on 9/11. I was on Route 42, actually running late. First plane had already hit. I'm listening to the radio, talking to my boss, Tracy Russell, and she says, "Hang in, we're assessing." She calls me back a few minutes later after the second plane hits and says, "You're going to New York." Fine. She says, "Do you want to go home and get some clothes? Your lobby will be up there a while." Well, I made a quick executive decision based on my experience covering a lot of disasters. I knew that getting up there as quickly as possible would be the key to getting inside. The bigger the story, the bigger the disaster, the larger that ring of inaccessibility is. So I took off up the New Jersey Turnpike. I stopped at a rest area where, for the first time, I sort of got a sense of the magnitude of this. At the rest area, people had been pulling in just to get information, and at the rest area, people were sobbing. People were calling up to New York City, trying to reach loved ones. And I'm starting to do interviews with these folks, and then back onto the New Jersey Turnpike. As I get up to about the Newark Airport, which of course would be central to all of this, traffic comes to an almost complete stop. And I have to get over to New York City one way or another. So I'm winding my way through. I'm on the shoulder. I'm on the median where there is one. I'm in a marked car, so as mobile units go by, and they had started to shut down the roads and bridges up in that area. Fortunately, it was early enough. They were mostly volunteer folks, and I was able to talk my way through some of these barriers to get across the Verrazano Bridge and get over to eventually Liberty State Park on that first day. And a vivid memory of Liberty State Park early on was the dozens, maybe hundreds of ambulances that were there waiting to triage victims who came from Manhattan, and I don't know that there were any. And as Jay alluded, I started doing reports on the Turnpike, often based just on the smoke that I could see from the towers. And I could see that from 40 to 50 miles away. And I saw the change when the towers come down, not knowing what had happened, but then piecing that together, listening to KYW and also to our sister station, WINS in New York.
You know, TV has a unique set of problems when it comes to doing the exact same thing that Tony was doing. They have to put pictures to it. So you need more than just one person in there. You need equipment, you need the truck, you need the camera people. Robin McIntosh was sent to New York fairly early.
Actually, it was sent Wednesday, the day after, when it first
Not
happened.
so early.
Well,
Did Terry beat you there?
did you? Scooped again. Actually, I went on Wednesday. On Tuesday, I was driving in like everyone else, heard it on the radio, came into the station, found out what happened, realized after the second plane hit this was huge. I said to the news director, I said, let's get a TV out on the street. We were at Independence Mall, always lots of people around. So we got this big screen TV that we kept in the studio, rolled it out, got some extension cords hooked up to it, set that up in the little plaza in front of the station, and people would come up and watch this thing. And we taped them on Tuesday morning, watching this, and as you said, they were literally crying watching this. Now, that's terrible to watch someone else, but my daughter at the time, and still does, live in Washington. Her commuting route was the Pentagon. So I was saying, oh, you know, these towers, all of a sudden the Pentagon got hit, and we heard that report, and I'm going, oh my God, I've got to call my daughter. So I've got to call her, trying to get through to her. Of course, every cell phone tower in the city, in the country was jammed. Couldn't get through to her. She also worked at the Eisenhower building, right at the foot of the Capitol building. And I said to myself, you know, these buildings, at the time actually, we were told and thought that one of the targets might have been Independence Hall. I mean, these were iconic structures that were being hit in the city, and we thought, you know, Philadelphians that we are, of course the terrorists know about Independence Hall, and that'll probably be Liberty Bell. Well, fortunately, that wasn't the case. But the city, whole office buildings were being evacuated. The city, all the city employees were told to evacuate. So we were, people were lining up at buses to get away from Center City because they thought the entire city of Philadelphia might be a target for one of these planes. So that was going on. Meanwhile, my son, of course, I heard one of the planes that hit the towers was from Boston, and my son was working in Boston, did a lot of flying for Arthur Anderson. And I'm saying to myself, you know, so I've got a son in Boston, a daughter in Washington, and I'm trying to call, and we're trying to interview people, you know, please pick up the phone. So it was a personal kind of a thing as well. I did leave on Wednesday. They had sent Ren Scott earlier with a car. It took them 8 hours to get from Philadelphia to New York City because just what Tony was talking about. So, you know, it was an issue. I said, I'm going up to New York. He said, yeah, don't worry, you're just going to be there for the day. And I came home 5 days later. So, you know, It was one of those things.
Terry Ruggles, what was your first impression when you got to New York City and saw what was
Well,
going on?
it's humbling and scary, but let me back up a minute because I think I can supplement some of the problems that we had, that Tony had, and everybody else did. The first tower, the North Tower, got hit at 8:46. 9:03, the South Tower gets hit, and then we start seeing these pictures. And Charlie Gaines and I got in a car and immediately started driving towards Manhattan. Now, one of the things that happened was that NBC and CBS's relay towers and sat stuff was on top of the World Trade Centers. CBS's was on the Empire State Building, as I remember. So right away you have two networks that are at least partially out of commission to be able to get the pictures that they want to do. So Charlie and I are driving up the turnpike as fast as we can, and we start hitting into the problems that Tony faced, and I get a call on the telephone, and they say, network wants you to go to South Hackensack. And I said, well, what's in South Hackensack? We don't know. Network just says go to South Hackensack. So I know that I'm not going towards Manhattan anymore. I didn't know there was a South Hackensack. We find South Hackensack. We go to the address, and it's a big 8-story building that looks like a black battery. And I walk in. I said, my name is Ruggles. I'm from the NBC ONO in Philadelphia. What am I doing here? Well, we are the sports satellite dish network station, or the center. All of NBC Sports came into South Hackensack, keeping in mind that the World Trade Center is out of commission. So all of a sudden, this is now a very key point. So I go upstairs, do the same thing, Ruggles, Philadelphia, what do you want me to do? They say, get on the phone and call Charlotte. Again, I'm in South Hackensack, the action's in Manhattan, down by the Battery, and I'm calling Charlotte. Pick up the phone, Bruce Hall answers the phone. I don't know if you remember Bruce Hall, but he was with CBS for a long time. He's one of my heroes. A great writer, this guy could turn a word just like that. I said, Mr. Hall, my name's Terry Ruggles, yada, yada, yada. He said, here's what I want you to do. Do you know what happened? I said, yes, sir, I do. He said, I want you to write a 90-second chronologue of what happened and leave it loose and leave me lots of breathing space. Fine. So I do that. I get it back to him in a half an hour. He said, Terry, this is fine. What do you want me to do next? They put me up on the roof, and I'm easily 7 to 10 miles from the Battery, but over my shoulder, you can see everything. And it's like I'm on a chimney on a Christmas picture. That stuff just goes over my shoulder. So I stood there from 11 o'clock in the morning to 11 o'clock at night, and I was the local reporter for every NBC affiliate in the United States. And what they would do, they were just lined up like train cars, and first I'd do Minneapolis, and then I would do St. Louis, and then I would do Detroit. And as, of course, keeping in mind that there's 3 hours time difference, so the nation is waking up to this, and all of a sudden, 3 hours later in San Francisco, people are just getting up. So I noticed that Detroit keeps taking me every half hour, and all I've ever given Bruce Hall is this 90 seconds of loose chronologue. So in between, when I'm getting a drink of water and using the bathroom, I say, what is going on here? Does Detroit really want to know what me every half hour? It's kind of boring. He said, no, what they're doing is in Charlotte, which is getting their pictures from New York, is taking and changing the pictures and the sound bites every half hour. So every half hour, NBC is putting out a different story. It's the same framework, but well, I was blown away because I'm from the O&O market, and I had never had that luxury, which apparently happens at the network quite often, or that's SOP. So I was just blown away. I don't mean to keep talking here, but this gets back to the problem of getting into Manhattan. Gaines and I finally at 11 o'clock are good nighted, somebody else comes on, and they've got to do the 3 o'clock stuff into Los Angeles and California. We can't get to the hotel they reserved for us because the Meadowlands has been turned into a disaster area, and it's a marshalling area for all kinds of ambulances. So we can't get to that big hotel that's over by the Meadowlands. So we just plop into a motel. We're there for a half an hour. The desk calls and said, we know you can't get into Manhattan driving, but we're told that you can get in if you go to Jersey City or Elizabeth or one of those places and go in by path. So what's this all about? We don't know, but we think you can do that. So we just go on a fly. We just go on a fly. And sure enough, what they're doing is you still can't get into Manhattan, but this is where the federal government is funneling in all their emergency people and all their inspectors. So we just play dumb. Charlie has the camera. We just sit there and we get out very close to the Battery. We get out and it's now morning and light is coming up. Now we have to walk through a series of police barricades to get down to ground zero, but that's where we want to be. We want to be down to ground zero. So we bullshit our way through a couple, and as the closer you get, the harder it gets to get through. So finally we get down, and we're at the last one. We're at the very last one, and the guy's not going to let us through. He says, only New York media can get through. Well, sometimes it's better to be lucky than good, because I pull out my press pass, and I say, yeah, but my press pass is signed by John Timoney. And John Timoney used to be the assistant police commissioner in New York City. Well, this guy was flummoxed. He didn't know what to do. So he said, oh, go on through. So we get down to ground zero, and we get down there, and Dave Schratweiser from 29 is already there, which honked me off. You know, I thought I had this coup. And we're all kept in a marshaled area down there, and it's right on West Street, if you're familiar with New York, right down going to the Battery. And they're going to take us down in groups. So we don't get to go down with the first group, and we're like 2 blocks away. And Charlie Gaines, tall cameraman, I don't know if you know him or not, has been over talking to a cop on the other side of West Street, right on the side of the river. He comes across the street and he says, this cop is going to take us down to ground zero. I said, what for? He says, I don't know, but he says he'll take us to ground zero. So we walk across the street, and this cop, for I don't know what reason, escorts us to ground zero. So we're standing there with all the hard hats and the construction stuff, and I'll tell this last story and then I'll shut up. I'm standing there, and I don't remember the guy's face, but it was a hard hat and a plaid shirt. And he's just staring at this concrete and cinder block and chrome and dust. And he says, they don't get it. And I looked at him like he's talking to me. He says, they just don't get it. And he's still not making eye contact with me. And then he says, the strength of this nation isn't its buildings, it's its people. And I've used that line in every speech I've given for 15 years, and it makes people cry. The strength of this country isn't its buildings, its people. That was my experience at Ground Zero. I stayed a couple more days, but that was my initial 36 hours.
Incredible. There's something about Tim Lambert I didn't mention when he came up. I thought we'd save that for now. Tim was working in Harrisburg at the time, in Harrisburg Radio, but his family were part owners of some of the land in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, where Flight 93 came down. What were you thinking?
Well, on that day, I really didn't have a lot of time to think about it too much. I was on the way to work. I-81 was shut down into New York. Harrisburg's Urban Rescue Squad was the first out-of-state first responder to call into New York to try to help find survivors. And I was driving in around 9:30 or 10 o'clock, speeding because I knew the police weren't going to be, worried about what I was doing 90 miles an hour on Route 15. And I heard that a plane had gone down in Shanksville. And being the journalist, thinking, my dad grew up there, he's got to know somebody. I'll have a nice source. This is great. So the day's going on, just chaos. We're running around the newsroom just trying to make sense of it all and how central Pennsylvania has been impacted by this. And I stopped. I still remember this clear as a bell. 4:30 in the afternoon, I stopped in the newsroom, looked up at the television. There was a network television reporter who was standing at the Lambertsville-Shanksville Road. And that's when it sort of hit me, like, we have property really close to there. So everyone kept talking about it's a reclaimed strip mine, it's just this field. And so I couldn't get any answers as to what was going on. So, the day goes on. I finally get home at 1:30, 2 o'clock in the morning. And had a voicemail from my dad who said, he always seems to forget I'm a journalist. So he says, I don't know if you saw the video or not, but those hemlock trees by the crater, those are ours.
Oh, my.
And I thought, what is he talking about? So I picked up the phone, I called him, he's awake. And he said, yeah, I grew up there, I know those trees, that's it, that's our property. What do we do? And, I'm trying to process all this, and all I could say was, I think they're kind of busy right now. They'll probably find us when they need us. And sure enough, about 4 or 5 weeks later, we had a call from the Somerset County coroner, Wally Miller. And this is the first conversation I had with Wally, which has led to a wonderful friendship 15 years later. And he said, we're cleaning up the property, and it's cordoned off from anyone, but landowners can come in. I want you to come and take a look and see what we're doing to clean it up. And I said, well, okay, it sounds like we're probably going to work together for a few years, so I just want to tell you I'm a reporter. And Wally, so? I said, okay, I'd like to bring a camera and a recorder and tape our tour because nobody's allowed in there. And he said, you're the landowner, do what you want. I can't stop you. So I was able to produce a story from the actual crash site that a reporter hadn't been on since September 11th.
Good for you. No, that's a great story.
Thank you. And I think it's also important to point out, what we were all doing on that day. This was pre-internet. This was well, I guess cell phones were around, but it wasn't like you could use them everywhere.
No Twitter.
No Twitter, no social media. So this was all old school, like shoe leather, as these guys have said. I mean, you really had to work the phones, and you didn't have your phone. You could just send something out right away. You had to find a way to get a hold of people. So it was a challenging day. I mean, it's the most challenging day I've had in my 20-some year career.
I think it's funny the way the mind works. It dawned on me as I'm on the way to Washington, realized I have no cell phone service anyway. but my son lived only a mile from Ground Zero on the Lower East Side. And I hadn't even tried to call him yet because my mind was so full of the story itself, trying to get through the station, trying to get through to anybody else I knew that could help in Washington. And I'm getting no service. Finally, my phone rings. That's my son. He said, Dad, I know you know what's going on. I just want to let you know that I was okay. And I lied. I said, yes, Spence, I've been trying to get you. And you know, all I could think about was a day was going to come where they'd give out an award for the worst dad of the year, and I would hear my name called.
Yeah.
But I ran into I stopped at a rest stop. You know, one of these things that nobody talks about is when you're on the road on a story like this, eventually you have to go to the bathroom, never mind eating. So I stopped at a rest stop knowing that, you know, the rest of the day may not happen. And there were 2 Maryland state troopers, and I said, look, I'm on my way to Washington, I'm a reporter, am I going to have any trouble getting in? I'm still over 2 hours away. And the cop said, no, you're not going to have any trouble, everybody else is getting out. Nobody's going in. Well, you all know the scene down there. I didn't get over to the Pentagon the next day because my assignment had been Congress primarily, and the expressions of total disbelief that I was getting from people that are normally very composed was unbelievable to me. But the interesting thing was nobody wanted to start pointing fingers yet until they knew more about what was happening and where it was happening. I want to ask a
I was
question.
going to just jump in. You were talking about, and I think it is important, the personal impact. Everyone sort of touched on that, and Robin and I mentioned it earlier when we were talking at an aside. When you're covering something like this, I compare it to an athlete. You're in the zone, like you're focusing on what you're doing, but it has a tremendous personal impact on you. My experience was similar to yours with your son. I was over at Liberty State Park, and people were coming across, and there was one fellow I remember covered in dirt as all the pictures we had seen, and I said to him, you know, what happened to you? And he said, a building fell on me. I mean, trying to take that in. I hadn't seen any of the video yet. So you just see this. And there was a family coming, they came over by boat from Manhattan to Liberty State Park. I remember vividly, it was a mom and a little baby, infant baby, and the grandparents. And they were covered in dirt, not as much as the other man, but they were covered in dirt. And this was a little later in the day, and they wanted to get out, but there was really no way to get out of Liberty State Park other than walking. And again, you have grandparents, mother, child. And I'm talking to them, I did interviews and tape, and they wanted to get out, and they were asking me if there's any way. They were calling a cab. That was impossible. So finally, I decided to leave my location and ride them out as far as I could without leaving the secure area, just to at least get them along the way. And they were very grateful, and they said, you know, can we give you anything? Can we give you money? And I said, no. I said, and they had the baby all wrapped up. And I said, just let me see the baby. And they showed me this little, and I really do forget now whether it was a little boy or girl, but just this angelic little baby. And I remember thinking even at the time that it was just so sickening that such evil and innocence should cross paths as they had on that day. And moments after they got out of my car, and I was heading back up to my other location, my daughter Jen had just gotten out of school, high school, and she called me to see if I was okay. And for one of the very few times in my entire career, and I saw some terrible things, I just broke down and sobbed. It was too much.
You know, there's a question. Everybody has their own method. But what happens when you get emotional and you're on the air? How do you work through it?
I just just wanted to say, when Terry started to well up, there was this little semi-controversy. One of the CNN medical reporters was reporting from New York, and she got emotional on camera, and it started this big discussion among the CNN people, and I guess outside, well, how should you or shouldn't you? You know what? We're human, and you see terrible things, and your job is to keep your shit together, basically, but we're human, and I think that was one of the times, like Walter Cronkite with the tear in his eye about Kennedy's death, when some reporters were just human in front of the camera, and I think that was absolutely fine. But it did start a debate, and I'm not on camera, so you guys would be better to address that.
You could detect that, with Terry, when you were speaking about the description of the building.
One thing that, as a follow to that, I don't know, Robin, you were at the SAG-AFTRA meeting that they had here like a year and a half ago in Center City. It was from all over the country. And they had a guy who was at JAL in Washington who had been there, and he was driving to work and saw the plane go into the Pentagon. And the point of his presentation in a documentary he made was to reporters who covered both Washington, New York, and I'm assuming Shanksville also. It literally created am I saying it right, PTSD, a psychological problem that reporters needed help for, psychological help and counseling. And he noticed it was happening to him. He sought help and went on to make a foundation. But it brings up the question, getting away from this a minute, if you see a tragic accident, a big accident on an expressway where people die, or if you're shot at in a war zone, or if you're shot at in West Philadelphia, there's some baggage that you pick up when that happens, and certainly 9/11 was one of the premier places where that could happen. I don't know if you had any ramifications from what you saw or not.
No, I don't know what's wrong with me, but first of all, you're rushing around so much to try to get information and stuff. You all of a sudden become, I think in hindsight now, even 15 years later, it's an emotional situation. When they asked me to do this, I said, I've got some DVDs. I pulled them out. I asked Jerry if I could show them. He said, no, there's too much light in here. But when you put those DVDs on, one of the things I was assigned to do was bring a local flavor to it. So I'm on the West Side Highway. Turns out to be the area where all the rescue units were all lined up to go in to get what they thought at the time were survivors. And I'm standing there and I'm looking down, oh, there's a ambulance from Avalon, there's a fire truck from Delran, and I said, well, these are people I'm going to talk to. And they're all sitting there and they're saying, we're next ones to go in and we're going to go find people and so forth. And I'm saying to myself, that was then, this is now. So while I'm looking at these DVDs, all of a sudden it's welling up inside of me that, this was our innocence that's now gone, that these people had optimism that they were going to find people, that they were going to rescue people. And now, of course, in hindsight, there weren't any, and yet I'm sitting here with, 15 years of knowing what happened and realizing what happened to all of our lives. We're now being, shoes are off at the airport, and the whole 9 yards. And that is an emotional kind of a thing. So while I'm looking at these DVDs in Avalon, New Jersey, it's hitting me still 15 years later.
Tony?
Yeah, I actually have a clip that goes to what was happening on the West Side Highway and the emotion of all that was going on the 11th and the 12th. And it just very quick background. The morning of the 12th, I took one of the first trains over to Manhattan, which was an adventure in itself on that morning. I walk up the train station steps in Greenwich Village, and there is nobody on the streets of New York City. I walked about 8 blocks before I saw a single person. I mean, the city that never sleeps was absolutely silent. I walked toward Ground Zero, get down, I did the tours as we all did that morning, gathering information. I left. Later that day, I come up those same steps in Greenwich Village, and I hear cheering, like a football game's going on. There's no sound I could have heard at that moment that could have stunned me more. I literally stopped, and I was like, what the is that? So I go up the steps, I followed the noise down to the West Side Highway, and people who couldn't come out of their homes earlier that day had come out to show that we'd be back, if you have that clip.
Oh, yeah. Oh, you've got it, Dick. Should have been a radio.
The update from KYW's Tony Hansen. Tony?
Steve, I'm along the riverfront, Hudson River in Manhattan, and I'm really witnessing one of the most remarkable events that I've ever seen. Very moving. Hundreds, even thousands of citizens have come out along the riverfront here, and they are applauding. They're applauding the police, the firefighters, anyone who goes by. They are applauding. The American spirit is alive and well in New York City. It's alive and well here in Manhattan. Again, thousands of people down along the riverfront after the terrible tragedy that's befallen this community. People have come out here today, and they are applauding every person that comes by, whether it's a volunteer, the police, the firefighters. It's extraordinary. So many firefighters and policemen have lost their lives in this. No one knows the count yet. But these people have come out to show their support. They are applauding the brave police and firemen who survived, and certainly saluting those who died. Reporting live from Manhattan, Tony Hansen, KYW News Radio.
I just want to say, I remember right before I went on the air, I had tears in my eyes, and I remember telling myself, don't mess this up. You talk about controlling your emotion. There are times when I guess you can show it. I could not let it interfere with, maybe in my lifetime, the most pivotal moment in American history. I mean, it was that crucial at that moment to not mess that up.
Well, you know
Well, you didn't, Tony.
how in your face it was. I was, at that same time, it was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon when this happened, and they started putting them down before the third building came down, because the third one came down the next day, or you know, the day after. I remember the police, but what got me emotional was these construction guys, and guys are driving by in these big Euclids and Volvos and earth movers, and if you had a hard hat on, you were a hero.
You were a hero.
It was really chilling.
You know, I want to ask Tim a question. I think I mentioned earlier that Tim, his role is multimedia, which means digital, broadcast, television, the whole thing. We've been talking about fairly traditional media, television, we do exclusively radio, television. Oh, by the way, did I mention that Tim isn't retired? I don't know if I mentioned that. Tim,
I wish I was.
yeah. Tim, that story today, given what you've known over the years of it, how do you think it would be most effectively covered today?
That's a tough one.
What would you do?
Well, I would think that today, if this were to happen, it would be a lot more chaotic, if that's even possible. You would have there would be so much information flowing out of Twitter and Instagram and Facebook Lives, and the flow of information wouldn't be controlled. And I think with a little bit of the splintering of the media, that since there's so much now, left, right, bloggers, you know, independent journalists, that I don't know, I think it would just be chaos, really. I think the information that was slowly seeping out, there'd just be speculation. The conspiracy theories that took a couple of years to develop would be instantaneous. I mean, I don't know. That one, in that instance, using 9/11 in today's media world would be something really overwhelming.
I have a thought. I'm
Karen?
not an expert on this, but my sense is for those networks and local stations who lost their power when lost their antenna, people would have been able, because there was still power in buildings, to get onto their computers, maybe not their phones, but they could have gotten on via Skype through an internet connection and been feeding pieces onto the websites of CBS and ABC and everybody. So I think it would have been, we couldn't get anything from any of our people on the scene because cell phones and beepers weren't working. But if they could have gotten onto an internet connection there, fed in cell phone video from their phone, there might have been a lot more of the moment reporting from the scene immediately after, I think.
I think what you said about chaos is very interesting because this will not be the last major kind of thing that we are going to cover. Very interesting what you said about in non-professional journalists getting onto positions of power. I don't care if it's Facebook or blogging or Twittering or all that kind of thing. You know, we are trained journalists. You know, we are told you tell the truth and you don't open your mouth until you know it's the truth, or at least have a 99%. A lot of these people who are getting on these social medias are just throwing these things out, and God forbid that kind of thing goes out there and a significant portion of the population starts to believe untruths, you know, because that is a very dangerous thing. You know, we're all, you know, the mass media has its limitations, but at the same time, the mass media, when you're talking to the majority of the people with trained people telling you what the truth is, that's a lot more controlled than the chaos that comes out of 50,000 people who think they're journalists.
Without that control, I think you really are generating instant panic.
Well, that's it, and and God forbid.
You know, we have about 10 minutes left, do we, Jerry? Where's Jerry? I got a stiff neck.
Jerry's here.
Okay. We have, oh, there you are. I didn't even have to turn. We have about 10 minutes, so I'd like to open up the discussion if anybody has a question. Ed, any of the members?
This is addressed to all 7 of you who experienced this 15 years ago.
That's a microphone, Ed.
I'll repeat this. This is a question addressed to all 7 of you who experienced this 15 years ago. Having had that experience and looking at the presidential elections in front of us today, where would you feel safer, with a Hillary Clinton or a Donald Trump?
No, Ed, I'm sorry.
I'm touching that with a
Let's not do that. Let us not go
Nice try,
there.
though.
Nice try, Eddie.
But yeah, good.
I will say something to that, though. I will say that 15 years later, and having gone through a lot of commemorative events up at Stony Creek Township for Flight 93, I will say that I've been asked a lot about, 15 years later, what do you think about how Flight 93 is perceived? And I think one thing that has been lost is the story of Flight 93, the passengers coming together, passengers from all over the world who didn't know each other. They got together and they did something very American. They took a vote on what to do. Do we stay and sit and take this, or do we rise up and try to take back the plane? And they tried to take back the plane. That teamwork does not exist in society today. Political, social, whatever, it's just gone. So when people get up there and wave the flag about Flight 93, I mean, a right-wing blogger was talking about this being the Flight 93 election. I mean, talking about spitting in the face of what their memory. It had nothing to do with politics. It had everything to do with living for the day and working together, and that in this society doesn't exist anymore. So that lesson is lost, and I think that's just sad.
Okay, Tim.
Dangerous.
Yeah. Hi, Jay. Last time I was with Jay, we were on a helicopter flying off the Constellation going back to the Navy.
I remember
Yard.
that. Mm-hmm.
Right. I had my very good friend was in the building when the plane hit. He was in training with Morgan Stanley. Now, the plane hit on what, the 85th floor? Something like that?
83 to 87.
Okay. They were 3 floors below. And this is what he told me. He said, the building shook. He said the alarms went off, everybody jumped up, and the security guard, Morgan Stanley had it on every floor, said, stay in your seats, don't leave, we don't know what's going on. Somebody said, by that time, had looked out the window and said, it looked like a body falling out of the window, coming out, falling out outside the building. They immediately went to the exit. They had to take the stairway down. And on the way down, they met the firemen coming up who were going to die. It took him, they got out of the building safely, and it took them, all the people from Morgan Stanley had to go through counseling because they were all so shook by this, seeing that they could have been killed had they not been gotten out of the building and those firemen going up the building. Also another thing, my niece was coming up the subway, and she had heard something down below, and as she's walking up the steps, something red flashed against the wall next to her. It looked like a body part. She ran right downstairs. My nephew had gotten off the train on Long Island. He had finished a shift for the NYPD. He got a call, come back, and we didn't see him for 3 days.
Yeah, we have time for maybe one more question. A question, please. Anybody? I see you.
Had to walk behind the camera.
Steve.
True pro.
Thank you. What nobody has mentioned on this esteemed dais today is that the day itself, 9/11/01, may have been the most beautiful, most pristine, gorgeous day imaginable. There was not a cloud in the sky, temperature in the low 70s, virtually no humidity, bright sunshine. It was a perfect day to almost go to the beach. And to have what happened on that kind of a day was like a weird incongruity.
Somebody said something about that earlier when we were talking, that couldn't imagine that a plane crashed in that kind of weather condition. Harry?
Yeah, I think I did say that, yeah. That the conditions were spectacular, like you said, and for such a tragedy to happen, and for us to remember it, the conflict there, yeah.
Do you know what the other thing is, when you really think about, if somebody had come to you and presented this notion that I think I'm going to fly a commercial airliner into one of the towers of the World Trade Center, and it's going to collapse as a result, you would have looked for some place to sign him up to get help. Because who was going to possibly think that flying a plane into a building like that would cause the building to fall? Now, they were either very lucky or very good, or a combination of both. Were they that smart, or were they just that lucky, the terrorists?
You know, one of the things as a manager in that situation, you know, journalists go to the story. Had we had any sense that the buildings would have collapsed, we would not have sent all of our staff.
Now, we're all smart, you know, on Monday morning.
Right.
After this sort of situation. You were asking about Hillary and Trump in a situation like this. George Bush got up and said, you know, these fellows who knocked down this building are going to hear from us. And at that point, everyone was cheering, you know, and 8 years later, you know, why do we go into Afghanistan? You know, we're all very smart years down the line. Who knows what will happen when anybody becomes president of the United States? History judges us. The moment is what the moment is, you know. So
Profound.
we all hope for the best.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody.